There's 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model. Because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. You're a node in a network. You're a node in a network.
Metaphor and epistemology.
You'll know it 1,000 people.
So I'm going to briefly go over in a couple of slides here what I hope to accomplish with this video and what's actually happening in the video. It's going to be a little bit lengthy, and it's still going to be just a jumping off point of what could potentially be a series of videos exploring this topic. So I'll be going through the question of the validity and veracity of metaphor using the first part of Nietzsche's On Truth and Lies in a non-moral sense. And if you're not familiar with that, it's really a fantastic essay on the subject. And so I'll be reading through most of the first part. I try to summarize parts where I can, but so much of it is such great writing, even in translation into English, that you really should listen to it and figure it out for yourself. I'm gonna use Northrop Frye's The Great Code again. I'm going to use the poetry of William Blake. I'm going to go and use The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. And if you don't know who Ian McGilchrist is, he did a short talk with Jordan Peterson a while ago. And after I saw that talk, I immediately bought his book and read it. It's, I haven't read Maps of Meaning yet. I'm going through Maps of Meaning in my Maps of Meaning Mondays. I wanted to read as much of what Jordan Peterson read before he wrote that book so that I could understand what he was thinking when writing that book. But Ian's book is, I would pair them together. They're very closely related. They're sort of going over the same problem, maybe from a different angle. And but Ian is a psychiatrist. He was a literary critic before that, and he held a chair in Oxford University. So he's really a giant intellectual and someone you could trust in his writing. I'm going to use Northrop Frye's Fearful Symmetry again, and that's another great book that everyone should read if they're interested in Jordan Peterson. I'm going to also mix in some of Jordan Peterson's own talks, because I just watched the first debate he had with Sam Harris, or the first discussion they had with Sam Harris, and so that's kind of on my mind, so it's going to come up here. And of course I have to touch on the noumenal world via Kant, and I'm just going to touch on it briefly. I'm not going to go into a whole Kantian lecture, in case you're afraid of that. I'm going to close with a very interesting quote from Karl Barth. So please stay until the end if you can. I know this is a long video, but that quote from Karl Barth is pretty interesting. And if you don't know who Karl Barth is, he's an eminent theologian. I think he was around the same time of Carl Jung and Freud and well, probably Carl Jung, and Bonhoeffer. He lived through that whole First and Second World War in Switzerland, I believe. And he wrote the Church Dogmatics. He wrote thousands and thousands of pages of just amazing theology. So when I pull a quote from him, I'm pulling it from the Epistle to the Romans that he wrote, a commentary on that book in the Bible. It's quite significant, and it's something to grapple with. It's not just something to dismiss if you're not into theology. And some honorable mentions in this video. It's Goethe, Thomas Kuhn, Wittgenstein, and Heidegger. If you're interested in those thinkers, they do get mentioned in some quotes here. There's someone else. who is it? Oh, Ted Hughes, the poet laureate. He gets a mention too. There's probably a few people I'm forgetting if you're interested in, but you'll see as I go through. And so what's the point? Some of the points I'm going to try to bring up here is that weights and measures are not all there is to justifiable belief. Justifiable belief is not the only standard. Argumentation is not all about reason and logic. You live out a story that is anti-logic and anti-reason your whole life, basically. Once you understand the story, you realize you are part of the metaphor. You are, in the most significant sense of being, a metaphor. And this is something I'm still grappling with and thinking about, but that's so far that I can understand. That's what it is. And I think this is partly what's going on with Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. And I'll get into this in more detail as we go through. So once upon a time, everyone will die. A bedtime story by Friedrich Nietzsche. Once upon a time, and he really starts it sort of like this. It's like a fable. Once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of that universe which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the highest and most mendacious minute of world history. Yet only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star grew cold and congealed, and the clever beasts had to die. And I say that is the charming nature of Nietzsche. He goes on to say that even if one invented such a fable, it wouldn't do justice to how transient and aimless and arbitrary human intellect looks within the framework of the natural world. The intellect was a device for detaining those poor beasts, he says, within existence momentarily before a crushing death. Associated with knowing is pride, and he, quote, it lies like a blinding fog over the eyes and senses of man, deceiving them concerning the value of existence. For this pride contains within itself a most flattering estimation of the value of knowing. So how can humanity come to value truth if it's made up of prideful liars? One of the things you're going to notice in this video, and in this story that Nietzsche tells, he tells a story. This is philosophy that's not quite philosophy. He's using metaphor, he's questioning metaphor, he's questioning language, but he's using language and metaphor to persuade you about his point of view. And pay attention to that, and it's quite masterfully done. The constant fluttering around the single flame of vanity is so much the rule and the law that almost nothing is more incomprehensible than how an honest and pure urge for truth could make its appearance among men. They are deeply immersed in illusions and dream images. Their eye glides over the surface of things and sees forms. Their feeling nowhere leads into truth, but contents itself with the reception of stimuli, playing, as it were, a game of blind man's bluff on the backs of things. Man lets himself be lied to every night in his dreams, and his moral sense never urges him to stop dreaming. This is what Nietzsche, I'm trying to summarize some of it so I don't have to read word for word the whole thing. So our moral sense never urges us to stop dreaming. We sleep. We never sleep in truth. We sleep in a lie, basically. We sleep in deceptions. So in our waking life, we're prideful liars. In our dreaming life, it's also all deceptions. So how do we come to truth? We cannot be truthful in our wakefulness, and we can't be truthful in our slumber. What's going on? He's also getting at the idea here that the old Greek idea of the forms, this sort of ideal piece of being that is like outside the natural world, that informs the natural world of what it should sort of be. And that gets sort of into the Platonic forms and Kant's Noumenon, Ding an sich in German, the thing in itself. we don't see the thing in itself. Our eyes glide over the surface of things. We only see the forms. We don't see the thing that is actually there. And I'm going to have to, I don't know, I think this is where I have to get into that after this slide. I have to get into that even more so, about what the noumenal is. I think in that previous slide. So it's the noumenon contrasted with phenomenon. The noumena is what's there to begin with, and what we experience is phenomena. Okay, if you just look at the words and hear the words, that's what's going on there. The noumenon is what's actually there. The phenomenon is what's experienced with our senses, and I'm going to get into that more in a minute. So Nietzsche goes on to say, what indeed does man know of himself? Can he even once perceive himself completely, laid out as if in an illuminated glass case? Does not nature keep much of him? Does not nature keep much the most from him, even about his body, to spellbind and confine him in a proud, deceptive consciousness, far from the coils of the intestines, the quick current of the bloodstream, and the involved tremors of the fibers? She threw away the key, and woe to the calamitous curiosity which might peer just once through a crack in the chamber of consciousness and look down, and sense that man rests upon the merciless, the greedy, the insatiable, the murderous, in the indifference of his ignorance, hanging in dreams, as it were, upon the back of a tiger. In view of this, whence in all the world comes the urge for truth? He goes on to speak about how man as a social animal created a culture that spurned the effects of lies, not lies themselves. It was not so much the lie itself that people didn't care for, or the value of truth in itself, but rather the repercussions of saying something that was untrue. Say, for example, that I am rich when in fact I am poor. Swindling people into a business deal because of this lie could harm them. Think of Bernie Madoff and other examples. So culture produces in man the desire not to lie for fear. So culture produces in man the desire to not lie for fear of being excluded from the group, which in most ages meant certain death. Similarly, it produces the desire for truth, but not truth in itself, but the after effects of living congruently within the framework of the culture, speaking the words agreed upon by the group in the way the group deems fit. And you might see a little bit of Jordan Peterson in that. In Canada, his group, his culture is saying he has to speak these certain words. He's saying those, and they're saying that's the truth. And that's what he disagrees with. He's saying that's not the truth. I can't be forced to speak those words. And he's spoken about this many times, there's just endless harm that can come from that. And it could spiral very quickly out of control. And, Nietzsche says, moreover, what about these conventions of language? Are they really the products of knowledge, of the sense of truth? Do the designations and the things coincide? Is language the adequate expression of all realities? Only through forgetfulness can man ever achieve the illusion of possessing a truth, in the sense just designated. If he does not wish to be satisfied with truth in the form of a tautology, that is, with empty shells, then he will forever buy illusions for truth. What is a word? The image of a nerve stimulus in sounds. But to infer from the nerve stimulus a cause outside us, that is already the result of a false and unjustified application of the principle of reason. The different languages set side by side show that what matters with words is never the truth, never an adequate expression, else there would not be so many languages. The thing in itself, for that is what pure truth, what consequences would be, is quite incomprehensible to the creators of language and not at all worth aiming for. One designates only the relations of things to man, and to express them one calls on the boldest metaphors. a nerve stimulus, first transposed into an image, first metaphor. The image, in turn, imitated by a sound, second metaphor. And here again, we're getting into Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Noumenon could be the Platonic forms. It's contrasted with phenomenon. The noumena is the thing that in itself, the thing out there that we don't perceive. The thing we perceive is the phenomena. And so that gets into Kant's theory of knowledge, transcendental idealism. I'm just going to read this little slide I found. You can see a picture of for those who are just listening, there's a picture of a man, and inside his brain, the mind imposes its categories on the data of experience. That's phenomenal realm. Causality, space and time are the a priori things we hold in our mind, and we're imposing that on what's out there. And there's an image coming out from his eyes of the stuff that's out there. We don't really know what the stuff is. We can only discern what it is based on our senses, and our senses are limited. So this is the noumenal realm outside of us. It's the external reality, the thing in itself, Ding an sich. Kant's theory of knowledge, transcendental idealism or critical idealism. We cannot know reality in itself, but only as it is to me. The mind imposed or organizes the raw data of experience according to the categories of space, time, and causality. Thus, space, time, and causality are not true of the thing in itself, the external reality, the noumenal realm, but are only true of the thing to me, the phenomenal realm. This enables us to have certainty of things like causality, since we never experience reality otherwise except according to the categories. So another way of talking about this, if you're having trouble understanding it, when I throw an orange ball for my dog, and it lands in some tall grass, and he goes to look for it, he can't, I don't think he visually sees it. I think dogs see colors differently. I forget what it is. Do they see no colors? Well, there's some kind of perceptual difference, right? So he can only smell where the ball is. He can't really see it. It kind of blends in with the grass. And so we know, there's a common sense way of thinking about it. We know that animals see the world differently. Dogs are familiar to a lot of people, and to say that the dog doesn't see colors or something like that is understandable to most people. And you can go further with that, and you can say, well, look, there are bats. They don't really see much of the world at all. They use echolocation, and it's through sound that they see the world, and they navigate through the world. And that's like a whole different way of seeing the world. And then you can think of even further extracted is a machine. If you build a machine to detect certain kinds of particles or wavelengths of light or something that we are unable to see, that no animal can see, it's perceiving the world in a certain way. And now what if you were to combine all the ways everything is able to perceive the world, from machines to all the animals on Earth, and just, stack all those layers of perception up into a being or into yourself? You would be seeing the world in a completely different way than you are. And sometimes when people take psychedelics or some drugs, they start to have extra perceptual experiences that are even more severe than that. So, for example, it's not just seeing more of the spectrum of light. It's hearing what you would normally see. You hear colors. You hear light. Instead of hearing music or sounds, you start to see sounds and music. So now you start to transposing senses onto each other, and now you're seeing perhaps what's really out there in another way. Again, you're not actually ever able to see what's really out there, because you're sort of imprisoned by your five senses, and even our conception of the five senses. Even if we transpose one sense for another, we're still not getting to what's potentially out there in itself, the thing in itself. Anyway, you could read all about that in Kant, and it is a complicated thing in many ways, and it's also a simple thing to just kind of get the idea across, so you can move on in this in this video. I hope that's a simple enough explanation of what that is, and maybe this picture helps, maybe this slide helps for the thing in itself, if you've never heard of the noumenal world. It's sort of like the first thing you learn in a philosophy class. That's what kind of got me into philosophy, is like just starting to open your eyes to what's really out there. So, and here I have this this slide here. I'm sort of interrupting Nietzsche's essay there with certain things to shed light on what he's saying. So here's a note from Ian McGilchrist's Master and His Emissary, and I'd say the first 100 pages of that book are just interesting bits that McGilchrist pulls from studies, all scientific studies that he kind of dove into and mined for his thesis about the divided brain and how it's forming the world. But in this one, this was an interesting note because it does focus on what metaphor is. And it's you could see the scientific citations if you want to go look up those studies for yourself. I won't be reading them, but I will read some of this or all of this note. So he says, there is some confusion over what is meant by metaphor. Obviously, there is metaphoric content to almost everything we say. Language is essentially metaphoric in nature, at the simplest level. If the chosen metaphor for an experiment designed to distinguish between the hemispheres is so bland, obvious, or banal, that it requires no imagination, presents no novel thought, and does not bring together disparate meanings, little is likely to be discovered. We know that unfamiliar phrases activate the right hemisphere, while familiar ones activate the left hemisphere. And then he cites the papers. So when it comes to metaphor, it is in keeping with this that poetic phrases such as rain clouds are pregnant ghosts are understood by the right hemisphere, while cliches such as babies are angels are processed by the left hemisphere. Specifically, it is not just the novelty inherent in metaphor, but the combination of novelty with the bringing together of disparate ideas that involves the right hemisphere. Although 2 recent studies, bravely aiming to repudiate a consensus built on 30 years of research, have purported to demonstrate that it is the left hemisphere that is principally involved in the appreciation of metaphor, they have only demonstrated what we already know, that the left hemisphere has a predilection for cliché. As long as a phrase is comfortably familiar, the phrase will activate the left hemisphere only. The metaphors used in one of these studies were very simple statements, such as the alarm clock is a torturer. Reference to torture is a used and overused way of expressing displeasure. It was torture having to drag myself out of bed this morning. This phrase is not essentially different from babies are angels. Bottini and colleagues who found a right hemisphere preeminence used phrases that still required the bringing together of 2 distinct ideas. Quote, the policeman who didn't give straight answers was jumping ditches. Rapp and colleagues justified using such simple phrases by referring to the fact that the right hemisphere is known to be involved in understanding more complex sentences. Maybe, but there is nothing whatever complex about the sentences as sentences in the Bottini examples. The only thing that is complex about them is that they require seeing the connection between 2 disparate things. That is the essence of metaphor, and it turns out to be beyond the capacity of the left hemisphere. The other study was similarly unlikely to test true metaphorical understanding. Indeed, the paradigm metaphor they report using, some surgeons are butchers, is hardly a metaphor at all. Probably, if anything, less so than babies are angels. But when the metaphor is of the kind encountered in poetry, rather than cliché, it is clearly the right hemisphere that is involved. And this is important for his work because, one of the parts of the book is showing the importance of the divided hemispheres. There's a reason why there are certain specializations going on in each hemisphere. There's a reason why they're divided, because the world is divided such that we need both ways of looking at it to be successful in the world. And I think that's what Peterson's getting to as well. And I think that's part of the clash Peterson has with Sam Harris. As much as Sam Harris tries to soften his views by talking about spirituality and meditation, I think he's still very left hemispheric. If you read McGilchrist, you'll understand that better, in that he's focusing on what he knows, he's focusing on fact, he's focusing on a mathematical truth, on a conceptual truth, a very concrete way of thinking. If you look into Vico, and Northrop Frye mentions this, he's very third phase in his linguistics. Everything has to be an either-or statement corresponding to reality. Anyway, he seems way out there in that. And Jordan, by contrast, I think is actually holding the middle ground. He's holding, like he often says, the area, the space between chaos and order. That's the optimal space to be. That's why McGilchrist says that's the brain. The brain hemispheres can sort of be construed that way. The left hemisphere is the order, and the right is the chaos, the imaginative and the literal. And you have to have both to really understand the world. You can't just understand the world left hemispherically, mathematically, conceptually, objectively. You have to have a you there to understand it. And that's the interesting thing that Sam Harris, I don't know if Sam Harris gets into that. We'll see as I watch more of the debates. Anyway, so again, here we go with Master and his emissary. Man knows himself only to the extent that he knows the world. He becomes aware of himself only within the world. Oh, here, you know what? I should complete that quote, because I didn't picture it in this picture, but on the previous page there is, this is Goethe speaking. And if you don't know Goethe, look him up. He was very influential on Jung and Nietzsche, and probably Jordan Peterson for that matter, because I think Jordan talks about Faust a lot. Goethe is widely known to be perhaps the smartest human being that ever lived, as far as we know. So it's worth looking into what he thought about things. So the quote starts with, "My perception itself is a thinking, and my thinking a perception. Man knows himself only to the extent that he knows the world. He becomes aware of himself only within the world, and aware of the world only within himself. Every new object, clearly seen, opens up a new organ of perception in us." And think about what Nietzsche's saying about how we infer from the nerve stimulus a cause outside us. McGilchrist goes on, "This last, perhaps somewhat cryptic sentence suggests that, for us, truly to experience something, it has to enter into and alter us, and there must be something in us which specifically corresponds to it as unique. A consequence of this, as Thomas Kuhn recognized, will be that those phenomena with which we have no affinity, and which we are not in some sense ready to see, are often not seen at all. Theory, in the conventional sense of the term, can restrict one's capacity to see things, and the only remedy is to be aware of it." And, by the way, just as another aside, Blake was of this opinion as well. Blake thought, you're bringing your own presuppositions of the world, your own worldview, to your work. And if you're a scientist, it doesn't matter if you're looking into a microscope or a telescope or a test tube. Or let's say you don't see something in the test tube, so you take it under the microscope to see whatever there is. There's a reason why you may not be seeing it. It's because you're not cognitively able to see it. It's not in your understanding yet. And once it becomes part of your understanding, then you can start to see it in the world. Let's say this is a small part of this, but you could in a way say that once you read a book, you start to see the world through the lens of that book. And I think McGilchrist gets into this with art. I don't know if I included it in these slides. but Merleau-Ponty, which Jordan Peterson cites sometimes, I think he's the one who said that works of art are not something we look at or we see. We rather see the world through the lens of the work of art. And if I have, hopefully I have included that quote directly, but it is very interesting to think about it that way. Understanding, then, is not a discursive explanatory process, but a moment of connection in which we see through our experience an aperçu or insight. All seeing is seeing as, not that a cognition is added to perception, but that each act of seeing, in the sense of allowing something to presence for us, is in itself necessarily an act of understanding. And he quotes, "An extremely odd demand is often set forth, but never met, even by those who make it, i.e., that empirical data should be presented without any theoretical context, leaving the reader, the student, to his own devices in judging it, the classic demand of Enlightenment science. This demand seems odd because it is useless simply to look at something. Every act of looking turns into observation, every act of observation into reflection, every act of reflection into the making of associations. Thus it is evident that we theorize every time we look carefully at the world." Theory, in this sense, according to Goethe, is not systematized abstraction after the fact, and separate from experience, but vision that sees something in its context, the making of associations, and sees through it. Reality was not, as Goethe and the Romantics came to see, the fixed and unchanging state of affairs that the left hemisphere assumes. The phenomenon must never be thought of as finished or complete, Goethe wrote, but rather as evolving, growing, and in many ways as something yet to be determined. Interestingly, in the light of the last chapter, he noted that reason is concerned with what is becoming, rationality with what has already become. Reason rejoices in whatever evolves. Rationality wants to hold everything still so that it can utilize it. That's the left hemisphere, is your right-handedness. The right hand seeks to grasp and utilize things as a tool. It's the left hemisphere is what McGilchrist says, reaches out into the world to grasp. It has always an agenda to hold something still, to utilize it. The right hemisphere only reaches out into the world. It puts out feelers, and it's always feeling whatever's out there, whatever it is. It has no agenda but that reaching out, which I don't know if I quoted here, but if I didn't, well, there you have it. And I don't know if you've listened to my other videos on Blake and fearful symmetry and so forth. What I just read is also very Blakean, and that's why McGilchrist adds the Romantics in there, because Blake was roughly one of them. And that was very Blakean. Blake was all about a living perception. He believed reality was present and living, and it wasn't, past and historical, past and fact. I'm probably misremembering that phrase, actually. It's an interesting phrase. I'll have to add it somewhere to the description when I'm done with this. Profound perception. So, all right. That we take part in a changing world, and that the world evokes faculties, dimensions, and characteristics in us, just as we bring aspects of the world into existence, is perhaps the most profound perception of Romanticism. This was not an idea or theory, but for the Romantics, an incarnate reality. One can see it in the paintings and feel it in the poetry of the period. It is related to the sense of depth, which is everywhere conveyed in its art. Back to the Nietzsche part of this video on truth and lies. And each time there is a complete overleaping of one sphere, right into the middle of an entirely new and different one. One can imagine a man who is totally deaf and has never had a sensation of sound and music, Perhaps such a person will gaze with astonishment at Cialdini's sound figures. Perhaps he will discover their causes in the vibrations of the string, and will now swear that he must know what men mean by sound. It is this way with all of us concerning language. We believe that we know something about the things themselves when we speak of trees, colors, snow, and flowers, and yet we possess nothing but metaphors for things, metaphors which correspond in no way to the original entities. In the same way that the sound appears as a sand figure, so the mysterious X of the thing in itself first appears as a nerve stimulus, then as an image, and finally as a sound. Thus the genesis of language does not proceed logically in any case, and all the material within and with which the man of truth, the scientist, and the philosopher later work and build, if not derived from Never Never Land, is at least not derived from the essence of things. In particular, let us further consider the formation of concepts. Every word instantly becomes a concept, precisely insofar as it is not supposed to serve as a reminder of the unique and entirely individual original experience to which it owes its origin, but rather a word becomes a concept insofar as it simultaneously has to fit countless more or less similar cases, which means purely and simply cases which are never equal and thus altogether unequal. Every concept arises from the equation of unequal things. This is very important. I'm now splicing in some William Blake, and as I'm doing this, I think it is kind of frustrating to hear Nietzsche and then hear someone else and then hear Nietzsche again. But I think it's, you could read through that Nietzsche's, it's a couple pages, 2 or 3 pages yourself. But I think it's important to have an interjection of some other kind of thought or some other kind of angle of thinking about things. So, Nietzsche's talking about how we form concepts and how concepts by their nature have to make equal, unequal things because they're used across the board universally. And here I'm just quoting some William Blake because he also is thinking about this, and he was no fan of such ideas, of getting rid of the unique and individual perception in favor of universal conception. So here he says, every eye sees differently. As the eye, such the object. Everything possible to be believed is an image of truth. Note the similarities of language. You're going to see image of truth, and image of God, and image of this and that, and all over the place among these thinkers, from William Blake to Northrop Frye to Jordan Peterson to Jung, because these are thoughts echoing through our ages. So every eye, every individual sees an object differently. William Blake famously saw the sun as the Hallelujah chorus, the heavenly host of angels singing Hallelujah, Hallelujah, right? Instead of as a little yellow disc in the sky. The sun's light, when he unfolds it, depends on the organ that beholds it, and that's what he's referring to there. Is that you can see the sun. Man can see the sun differently. It's part of your imaginative perception, and I go over this in it's in my Fearful Symmetry Fridays videos, that the objectifying of the world is the objectifying of the individual, and I think I subtitled this Fearful Symmetry, the obliteration of the individual. It's through this objectifying of the world that we obliterate the individual's perception, and we form a conception, and so the unique vision from an individual's eyes, every eyeball can be replaced by any other eye, because we're all forced to see the same least common denominator reality of this yellow disk in the sky. That's the sun. That's the object. That's what we're supposed to perceive. Anyway, I'll move on, because you can go look at those videos if you want. They're short videos. They're only 7 to 12 minutes long. So here again, Blake says, now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in the soft Beulah's night, and twofold always. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. Something interesting here, if you read William Blake, what I see when I read William Blake is a lot of Jungian ideas. And I think as much as Jung discarded Blake because he said he was too conscious of what he was doing, because Jung was interested in the unconscious movements of man, Blake was using a lot of language and using it in the way that Jung would later, I think, use it. And I probably will do a video about it as I can formulate the thoughts better. But this idea of the fourfold vision of man, the idea that man is fourfold because God is fourfold, that this is what Jung will come to realize and believe himself. Maybe in a slightly different way than Blake, but I think the seeds are there in Blake, and they grow with Jung. So what is he talking about here? The threefold is the world of lover, beloved, and mutual creation. It's father, mother, and child. You could think of it that way. And this is sort of an area of, it's sort of like outside of heaven. It's Beulah. It's sort of like a blissful place of reality. The twofold vision is the imagination's ability to detect the fallen nature of the world in comparison to the unfallen nature of what could be, the divine. So hopefully we have at least a twofold vision here on earth, that we can perceive using our imagination that things could be better and things could be worse, and that we are sort of in between, and that knowledge sort of will get us to where I want to go at the end of this video. So it's just important to keep that in mind. It's the twofold vision. It's about the imagination. Now the single vision is Newton's sleep. Now Blake used Newton and Bacon and Locke sort of as representations of a tyrannical evil, and it's the evil of the materialist, of materialism. And I call it the leaden world of the materialist, because just prior to them you had alchemists trying to turn lead into gold, and people, the materialists, look at that and criticize them for that and mock them for that, but they're analyzing what the alchemists were doing on the wrong level. You should analyze what they were doing for what they were actually doing. It was a spiritual practice where the lead represented themselves as fallen nature, as a base material of the world, and trying to get the gold was trying to attain the spiritual gold, trying to become closer to God, an elevation of their consciousness, as Jung put it. And so if you're in the materialist frame, the world is just lead. There is nothing higher. There is no gold. And because of that, consciousness is actually an illusion. It's the dream of the sleeper. You're just really an unthinking animal. The thoughts it's all an illusion, and you have no will, you have no free will. And I think this is something Jordan should have brought up with Sam in the first debate, but I guess maybe there was no time. I think it's a strong opener, but whatever. You're just an object like every other object in the universe with no will. Will is just an illusion. So that is when unequal things are made equal. Everything is lead, everything is an object, everything is concept. And I think you can also draw, now out of this, you can get communism, which is very pro-concept. The ideas are utopian, but it's very anti-individual. And so you have this kind of conceptual heaven that is in reality hell when it unfolds in reality. And that's just a side note. That's just something that comes to my mind. Back to Nietzsche. And in this you're going to see a lot of Blake as well. This piece right here, again, because Blake did not believe in these heavenly forms. He believed in intense individuality in the moment of perception. So Nietzsche goes on to say, just as it is certain that one leaf is never totally the same as another, so it is certain that the concept leaf is formed by arbitrarily discarding these individual differences and by forgetting the distinguishing aspects. This awakens the idea that, in addition to the leaves, there exists in nature the leaf, the original model according to which all the leaves were perhaps woven, sketched, measured, colored, curled, and painted, but by incompetent hands, so that no specimen has turned out to be a correct, trustworthy, and faithful likeness of the original model. We call a person honest, and then we ask, why has he behaved so honestly today? Our usual answer is, on account of his honesty. Honesty? This, in turn, means that the leaf is the cause of the leaves. We know nothing whatsoever about an essential quality called honesty, but we do know of countless individualized and consequently unequal actions which we equate by omitting the aspects in which they are unequal and which we now designate as honest actions. Finally, we formulate from them a qualities occulta, which has the name honesty. We obtain the concept, as we do the form, by overlooking what is individual and actual, whereas nature is acquainted with no forms and no concepts, and likewise with no species, but only with an X, which remains inaccessible and undefinable for us. For even our contrast between individual and species is something anthropomorphic, and does not originate in the essence of things, although we should not presume to claim that this contrast does not correspond to the essence of things. That would, of course, be a dogmatic assertion, and as such, would be just as indemonstrable as its opposite. So here you could even, again, you can hear some Blake in that Nietzsche saying, look, even our scientific understandings of species, our biological understandings, we're bringing ourselves to the table. That's what Blake said. To our perceptions of this objective world. Now, Blake did not deny the material world, but he said that we bring ourselves to it. We mix ourselves with our perceptions, with what we see out there, and that's what we form, and that's what we know. We don't just know a purely objectified nature or world, and Kant was saying we can never know what's really out there. We can only, we are locked in by our perceptions, and that's all that we can come to know, and that's all that we can be satisfied with in this life at least. So Nietzsche goes on to say, what then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, and embellished, and which, after long usage, seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of a sensuous force, coins which have lost their imposing, and are now considered as metal, and no longer as coins. I think Sam Harris has to read this. We still do not yet know where the drive for truth comes from. For so far we have heard only of the duty which society imposes in order to exist. To be truthful means to employ the usual metaphors. Thus, to express it morally, this is the duty to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie with the herd, and in a manner binding upon everyone. This is very interesting to me because Sam Harris is itching for Jordan to lie with the herd, to use the usual metaphors as they are understood in what Giambattista Vico would say is our third phase understanding of language, our concrete understanding where we quote, discard metaphor. Nietzsche's pointing out you cannot discard metaphor. Everything's going to be metaphor because that's the basis of language. But Sam Harris doesn't contend with that basis of language, that everything is metaphor. Instead, he goes for the dream he's living in. Forgotten the illusions. What Nietzsche's saying there, truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. Now this is, again, I think from an objectivist standpoint, that's true. from Sam Harris's standpoint. That's what he should believe is true. And he wants Jordan to use the metaphors, use the language in the third phase, just like everybody else. And if you don't, we're going to ostracize you and we're going to cast you out. And Jordan is refusing. Notice near the end of that first talk, the crowd clapped and cheered after Sam Harris kind of scolded Jordan for saying that he needed like 40 hours to talk about the resurrection, if the resurrection was true or not. And Jordan admonished the crowd saying, what do you want? A 1-second answer? Do you want to hear something? They want to hear the illusory metaphors, the illusory words that they're used to hearing in the third phase language that they are immersed in. Okay? Jordan is trying to cast off the illusions, cast off the third phase language, get back to the first phase, the metaphorical phase, get back to the original understanding of it, and mix it in with our third phase. He's not completely getting rid of it. He has to I think Vanderklay made an interesting observation that Jordan is a translator. He's translating the first phase into the third phase. He's trying to get us into this understanding through psychology instead of through theology or religion. Anyway, I just thought it just stood out to me here. So I'll start again here. We still do not yet know where the drive for truth comes from. For so far, we have heard only of the duty which society imposes in order to exist. To be truthful means to employ the usual metaphors. Thus, to express it morally, this is the duty to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie with the herd and in a manner binding upon everyone. Now man, of course, forgets that this is the way things stand for him. Thus he lies in the manner indicated, unconsciously and in accordance with the habits which are centuries old. And precisely by means of this unconsciousness and forgetfulness, he arrives at his sense of truth. From the sense that one is obliged to designate one thing as red, another as cold, and a third as mute, there arises a moral impulse in regard to truth. The venerability, reliability, and utility of truth is something which a person demonstrates for himself from the contrast with the liar, whom no one trusts and everyone excludes. Now I interject a little bit of Northrop Frye in The Great Code, and I sort of just touched on this, but it's important, I think, to read Frye's own words on this and to get perhaps a little bit more of a precise sense of it than what I'm able to give, as I'm still working through these concepts myself as I talk about them. So here's a quote from The Great Code. This third phase of language begins roughly in the 16th century, where it accompanies certain tendencies in the Renaissance and Reformation, and attains cultural ascendancy in the 18th. In English literature, it begins theoretically with Francis Bacon, and effectively with Locke. Here we start with a clear separation of subject and object, in which the subject exposes itself, in sense experience, to the impact of an objective world. The objective world is the order of nature. Thinking or reflection follows the suggestions of sense experience, and words are the servo mechanisms of reflection. Think about how Nietzsche is saying that the nerve stimulus is what produces an image, which produces a word. Continuous prose is still employed, but all deductive procedures are increasingly subordinated to a primary inductive and fact-gathering process. There's Sam Harris. Fact-gathering process. Science. The 17th century poet Cowley, hailing Bacon as the Moses who had led modern thought out of the Egypt of superstition, says, "From words, which are but pictures of the thought, though we our thoughts from them perversely drew, to things, the mind's right object, he it brought." You might have to look at that instead of hearing me read it, because it is kind of odd to hear it. Hence, this approach treats language as primarily descriptive of an objective natural order. The ideal to be achieved by words is framed on the model of truth by correspondence. A verbal structure is set up beside what it describes, and is called true if it seems to provide a satisfactory correspondence to it. So when Sam Harris says, "Do you believe in God?" he's saying that there is a thing called God out there in the objective world. And if you say yes, then you're referring to that which is out there in the objective world, this object. Now we can examine it. So how tall is it? How much does it weigh? What are the electromagnetic properties it has, and what elements is it made? So forth. And that's what Jordan is just not going to do. The criterion of truth is related to the external source of the description, rather than to the inner consistency of the argument. Its controlling figure, then, is a kind of simile. A true verbal structure is one that is like what it describes. In this phase, we return to a direct relation between the order of nature and the order of words, as in the metaphorical phase, but with a sharp and consistent distinction between the two. This involves a reaction against the transcendental perspective of the second phase. That's where Kant was. And extreme forms of third phase thinking demonstrate the impossibility of metaphysics, or declare that all religious questions are unmeaning. This is where Sam Harris says, you're just like Deepak Chopra. What you say means nothing. It has no referent. There's nothing you can study or point to in the real world. You're just saying, as Vanderklay says, the woo. The descriptive phase of language corresponds to Vico's, quote, vulgar or demotic, which implies that it is close to what had always been accessible and extensively used, but used more particularly in the ordinary language that does not become culturally ascendant. A Sumerian or Egyptian of 3000 BC, if he were ordering stone for a building or dickering with his in-laws about the finances of his marriage, and so forth, he would be using this sort of accounting language of a referential language of, how much stones there are and how much grain there is and so forth. Back to Nietzsche. As a rational being, he now places his behavior under the control of abstractions. He will no longer tolerate being carried away by sudden impressions, by intuitions. And this is something Blake was unwilling to do. Blake totally fought his whole life against this kind of submission to abstractions and conceptions of the material world. First, he universalizes all these impressions into less colorful, cooler concepts, so that he can entrust the guidance of his life and conduct to them. And I go over that in Fearful Symmetry Fridays, number 2, I think. It's the obliteration of the universal individual, the least common denominator reality. Everything which distinguishes man from the animals depends upon this ability to volatilize perceptual metaphors in a schema, and thus to dissolve an image into a concept. And now, do you hear in that the first page of Maps of Meaning? Check that out, Mo Meaning Mondays. For something is possible in the realm of these schemata which could never be achieved with the vivid first impressions, the construction of a pyramidal order according to castes and degrees, the creation of a new world of laws, privileges, subordinates, and clearly marked boundaries, a new world, one which now confronts the other vivid world of first impressions as more solid, more universal, better known, and more human than the immediately perceived world, and thus as the regulative and imperative world. Now, in that, you can clearly see, if you've read the Master and His Emissary, what Nietzsche's describing here, and Blake also touched on it, which I think I'm going to get to in the next slide. He's describing the left hemisphere's control and domination over the world and our thought. And this is Sam Harris. This is the world of laws, of subordinations, of hierarchies, and some of this lingo you'll see Jordan talk about. He'll talk about the hierarchies and schemata, schemes and stuff. And that's because Jordan has his foot in both worlds. He's in the order and he's in the chaos. This is the order. This is the left hemisphere. Blake was very much biased towards the right hemisphere, towards the creative, towards the chaos, towards the unknown. I'll continue with Nietzsche. Whereas each perceptual metaphor is individual and without equals, and is therefore able to elude all classification, the great edifice of concepts displays the rigid regularity of a Roman columbarium, and exhales in logic that strength and coolness which is characteristic of mathematics. Anyone who has felt this cool breath of logic will hardly believe that even the concept, which is as bony, four-square, and transposable as a die, is nevertheless merely the residue of a metaphor, and that the illusion which is involved in the artistic transference of a nerve stimulus into images is, if not the mother, then the grandmother of every single concept. But in this conceptual crap game, truth means using every die in the designated manner, counting its spots accurately, fashioning the right categories, and never violating the order of caste and class rank. And that just screams out that Sam Harris talk, when Sam Harris starts to say, look, I have 1 apple, I have 2 apples, and I can transfer that oneness and that two-ness to all kinds of things, and I can create powerful scientific truths that help organize the world for me and so forth. Think about that. So here, based on what Nietzsche just said, he's describing the left hemisphere, and Blake sort of made a whole mythological character out of the left hemisphere, and here's a picture of your reason, and there's some controversy over how to say his name. Some think it's from the Greek, to limit the horizon, to delimit, but there's no evidence that Blake knew Greek in 1794 when he created this character. And Blake was kind of punny. He was punny like that, so when he's personifying your reason, I'm just going with your reason as the name of the character. But here you see, this is, Blake's artwork. Blake was an artist as well as a poet, and he's using his golden compass from the sky. He was a sky god. I think I'm going to go over that in the next slide. So here's a little bit from the book of Your Reason, which I want to do a whole reading of because it's so magnificent and amazing. I just don't have time right now. He formed a line and a plummet to divide the abyss beneath. He formed a dividing rule. He formed scales to weigh. He formed massy weights. He formed a brazen quadrant. He formed golden compasses and began to explore the abyss. And he planted a garden of fruits. Blake also sees your reason as the Old Testament Jehovah. And the Old Testament has, there's lots of names for God in the Old Testament, but the Jehovah God, the sky God, the jealous God, Blake sees as a primitive projection of your reason. And so your reason in Blake's mythology is the sky God that plants the garden for his creation. And then it gets corrupted. And it's a very interesting myth that reflects on the biblical narrative and tries to bring light into it. Here's some more pictures of your reason, that old sky god of the Old Testament. Your reason he's known as the king of pride. He's also a Luciferian kind of figure. He's the sky god or the star god. He's fallen. He learns by experience, and actually in Blake's mythology, he learns from his experience, and he's able to learn that he was wrong, and he's able to repent, and he's able to be restored back to paradise, to his original self, his whole self. Rationality in its worst form, it's the ratio that Blake argues against, and it's what Nietzsche's talking about. What Nietzsche's talking about is ratio. He's an architect and builder of our mundane shell, what Blake calls the mundane shell. It's our world. He builds it upon geometric solids, so you hear kind of a reference to the old Greek philosophers. He's the founder of the temple of the religion of suppressed sex. So he's the God who cares if you masturbate, from that first Sam Harris talk. The temple of materialism. So he's also this scientific God. And the Druidic temple of natural religion. He's also this natural religion God. Back to Nietzsche. Just as the Romans and Etruscans cut up the heavens with rigid mathematical lines and confined a god within each of the spaces thereby delimited, as within a templum, so every people has a similarly mathematically divided conceptual heaven above themselves, and henceforth thinks that truth demands that each conceptual god be sought only within his own sphere. Here one may certainly admire man as a mighty genius of construction, who succeeds in piling an infinitely complicated dome of concepts upon an unstable foundation, and, as it were, on running water. I wonder if this is the river that Heraclitus stood in. Of course, in order to be supported by such a foundation, his construction must be like one constructed of spiders' webs, delicate enough to be carried along by the waves, strong enough not to be blown apart by every wind. As a genius of construction, man raises himself far above the bee in the following way. Whereas the bee builds with wax that he gathers from nature, man builds with the far more delicate conceptual material which he first has to manufacture from himself. I think this is an amazing way of thinking about it. In this, he is greatly to be admired, but not on account of his drive for truth or for pure knowledge of things. When someone hides something behind a bush and looks for it again in the same place and finds it there as well, there is not much to praise in seeking and finding. Yet this is how matters stand regarding seeking and finding truth within the realm of reason. If I make up the definition of a mammal, and then, after inspecting a camel, declare, "Look, a mammal," I have indeed brought a truth to light in this way, but it is a truth of limited value. That is to say, it is a thoroughly anthropomorphic truth, which contains not a single point which would be true in itself, or really and universally valid apart from man. At bottom, what the investigator of such truths is seeking is only the metamorphosis of the world into man. He strives to understand the world as something analogous to man, and at best he achieves by his struggles the feeling of assimilation. Similar to the way in which astrologers consider the stars to be in man's service and connected with his happiness and sorrow, such an investigator considers the entire universe in connection with man, the entire universe as the infinitely fractured echo of one original sound man, the entire universe as the infinitely multiplied copy of one original picture man. His method is to treat man as the measure of all things, but in doing so, he again proceeds from the error of believing that he has these things, which he intends to measure, immediately before him as mere objects. He forgets that the original perceptual metaphors are metaphors, and takes them to be the things themselves. Only by forgetting this primitive world of metaphor can one live with any repose, security, and consistency. Only by means of the petrification and coagulation of a mass of images, which originally streamed from the primal faculty of human imagination like a fiery liquid, only in the invincible faith in this sun, this window, this table, is a truth in itself. In short, only by forgetting that he himself is an artistically creative subject does man live with any repose, security, and consistency. And boy, does this strike me as Blakean. And Blake was pre-Nietzsche. And I don't think Nietzsche ever read any Blake, but of course you can come up with the similar ideas. But this is exactly true. I think this is what Sam Harris is forgetting. This is what Jordan Peterson is trying to strike. And, you know, if Jordan, he had a laptop there, if he just read this paragraph, I think it would have been interesting to see Sam's reaction to that. If but for an instant he could escape from the prison walls of this faith, his self-consciousness would be immediately destroyed. It is even a difficult thing for him to admit to himself that the insect or the bird perceives an entirely different world from the one that man does, and that the question of which of these perceptions of the world is the more correct one is quite meaningless, for this would have to have been decided previously in accordance with the criterion of the correct perception, which means in accordance with a criterion which is not available. But in any case, it seems to me that the correct perception, which would mean the adequate expression of an object in the subject, is a contradictory impossibility. For between two absolutely different spheres, as between subject and object, there is no causality, no correctness, and no expression. There is at most an aesthetic relation. I mean a suggestive transference, a stammering translation into a completely foreign tongue, for which there is required in any case a frequently inventive intermediate sphere and mediating force. Appearance is a word that contains many temptations, which is why I avoid it as much as possible, for it is not true that the essence of things appears in the empirical world. A painter without hands, who wished to express in song the picture before his mind, would, by means of this substitution of spheres, still reveal more about the essence of things than does the empirical world. Even the relationship of a nerve stimulus to the generated image is not a necessary one. But when the same image has been generated millions of times, and has been handed down for many generations, and finally appears on the same occasion every time for all mankind, then it acquires at last the same meaning for men it would have if it were the sole necessary image, and if the relationship of the original nerve stimulus to the generated image were a strictly causal one. In the same manner, an eternally repeated dream would certainly be felt and judged to be reality, but the hardening and congealing of a metaphor guarantees absolutely nothing concerning its necessity and exclusive justification. Every person who is familiar with such considerations has no doubt felt a deep mistrust of all idealism of this sort, just as often as he has quite early convinced himself of the eternal consistency, omnipresence, and fallibility of the laws of nature. He has concluded that so far as we can penetrate here, from the telescopic heights to the microscopic depths, everything is secure, complete, infinite, regular, and without any gaps. Science will be able to dig successfully in this shaft forever, and the things that are discovered will harmonize with and not contradict each other. How little does this resemble a product of the imagination? For if it were such, there should be some place where the illusion and reality can be divined. There's so much there. That's so interesting. But here I'm going to quote, after hearing, I think that's where I stop with Nietzsche's discussion. And there is a second part to that discussion, which I will have to touch on another time because this video is getting really long, as I thought it might, because there's just so much to go over here. But I think this should have come up it almost comes up in the talk with Sam Harris. And this is sort of a quote inspired by Ted Hughes, who's a poet laureate. I think he said, stories are as old as biology is old. And so that's where I remember this being talked about somewhere. And that's what kind of stuck in my mind. Stories are as old as biology is old. We see the body as a work of countless eons of evolution, the brain even more so as the magnificent, if not miraculous, work of blind evolutionary forces. But we forget that stories are just as much, if not more, part of what it is to be human, the pinnacle of creation, the top of the food chain. Stories have a history that is also many eons old, as far back as communication goes. And I think what you get into this is sort of what Jordan was getting into at the last few seconds of that debate. And it's what Jung was getting into with the collective unconscious, that there's something that's so far back that it's common to all of us. And this is something that Blake and Northrop Frye get into when they talk about nature providing images. Think of the sun, the moon, the stars, a tree, an ocean, a river, all these different kinds of images. The man, woman, child, birth, death, all of these types of images. And these images sort of form a grammar for the archetypes. And this is a structure for narrative. And this is the underlying mesh of religions across cultures and across time. That's why you can find so many commonalities. And this also kind of came up in the debate about a universal moral intuition. And that's why I note that Jordan gets into this at the end of the first Sam Harris talk. Oh, maybe there's still more Nietzsche. Okay. Against this, the following must be said. If each of us had a different kind of sense perception, if we could only perceive things now as a bird, now as a worm, now as a plant, or if one of us saw a stimulus as red, another as blue, while a third even heard the same stimulus as a sound, then no one would speak of such a regularity of nature. Rather, nature would be grasped only as a creation which is subjective in the highest degree. After all, what is a law of nature as such for us? We are not acquainted with it in itself, but only with its effects, which means in its relation to other laws of nature, which in turn are known to us only as sums of relations. Therefore, all these relations always refer again to others and are thoroughly incomprehensible to us in their essence. All that we actually know about these laws of nature is what we ourselves bring to them, time and space, and therefore relationships of succession and number. But everything marvelous about the laws of nature, everything that quite astonishes us therein and seems to demand explanation, everything that might lead us to distrust idealism, all this is completely and solely contained within the mathematical strictness and inviolability of our representations of time and space. But we produce these representations in and from ourselves, with the same necessity with which the spider spins. If we are forced to comprehend all things only under these forms, then it ceases to be amazing that in all things we actually comprehend nothing but these forms. For they must all bear within themselves the laws of number, and it is precisely number which is the most astonishing in things. Just as a side note, there was a book by Max Tegmark. He's a physicist, a mathematician. I think it's called The Mathematical Universe. And if you ever want to see what McGilchrist says is just a left hemisphere thinking, read that book. It's interesting to learn about science in that way. Tegmark's idea is that at base, what everything is, what we are, is just mathematical. We're mathematical structures. And he gives his argument for that. But that is completely what McGilchrist would say is a left hemisphere way of looking at the world, and it's looking at the world and finding what it already knows. He's a mathematician. That's what he understands best. And so what he found in the world was completely mathematical. And what Nietzsche is saying is that he's bringing to his perceptions of the world himself, his human understanding, and his understanding of number and so forth. All that conformity to law, which impresses us so much, is the movement of the stars, and in chemical processes coincides at bottom with those properties which we bring to the two things. Thus, it is we who impress ourselves in this way. In conjunction with this, it of course follows that the artistic process of metaphor formation, with which every sensation begins in us already, presupposes these forms and thus occurs within them. The only way in which the possibility of subsequently constructing a new conceptual edifice from metaphors themselves can be explained is by the firm persistence of these original forms. That is to say, this conceptual edifice is an imitation of temporal, spatial, and numerical relations in the domain of metaphor. Now here I interject with a page from The Master and His Emissary by McGilchrist. That error arises from either or, quote, either or thinking. It must be pleasure or it must be pain, coupled with sequential analysis. If both are present, one must give rise to the other, presumably pain to pleasure. The option that both emotions might be caused at the very same moment by the very same phenomenon is excluded. Something similar appears to lie behind a common misunderstanding of the sublime, another core romantic phenomenon. vast distances evoked by visual depth, grand objects, and perspectives become of great significance because of their metaphoric power to express a sense of ineffability, which is experienced physically and emotionally as much as conceptually. 10 years before Burke wrote his famous philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, his lesser-known contemporary, John Bailey, wrote that, quote, "Every person upon seeing a grand object is affected with something which, as it were, extends his very being and expands it to a kind of immensity." What I would draw attention to here is the clear expression of the fact that, rightly beheld, the sublime expands and extends, not dwarfs, the being of the beholder. But the same depth that unites is also the evidence of separation. To the degree that one is united with something greater than oneself, one feels the expansion of soul that Bailey refers to. To the degree that one is aware of the separation, one feels one's smallness. This is intrinsic to the experience of awe, and I think you see this in the Bible a lot, in encounters with God, with the other, with the numinous, this experience of awe. The breakthrough in romantic thinking to the essential connectedness of things enabled them to see that those who are in awe of any great object, whether it be God or the vastness, beauty, and complexity of nature, do not set themselves apart from it. They feel something that is other, certainly, but also something of which they partake. Because of the empathic connection or betweenness of which depth here is a metaphor, they both share in the character of the other and feel their separateness from it. Reverence is no abasement. They understood, but with as much truth and Reverence is no abasement, they understood, but with as much truth and exaltation, a sense of belonging to something greater than oneself, which for the Romantics was the phenomenal world, and what one could see through it. And that interesting idea of seeing through the phenomenal world, I'm quoting Blake again here, because in Blake's poetry, he makes certain things that are opaque, tend to be sort of the evil side of things, and things that are translucent, that you can see through, are the virtuous and good. So he says, there is a limit of opaqueness and a limit of contraction in every individual man, and the limit of opaqueness is named Satan, and the limit of contraction is named Adam. What is above is within, for everything in eternity is translucent. The circumference is within. Without is formed the selfish center, and the circumference still expands going forward to eternity, and the center has eternal states. These states we now explore. And the depth as being metaphor, I don't know if I continue this on another slide, but just in case I don't, I looked up in Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. He uses depth, deeps, and something else, I think 260 times in that little book. Depth and height become symbols of profundity. The essential element in the sublime is not merely something large, but whose limits, like a mountaintop that is lost in a cloud, are unknown. The notion of depth, writes Berlin, is something with which philosophers seldom deal. Nevertheless, he continues, it is a concept perfectly susceptible to treatment, and indeed one of the most important categories we use. When we say that a work is profound or deep, quite apart from the fact that this is obviously a metaphor, I suppose from wells which are profound and deep, when one says that someone is a profound writer, or that a picture or a work of music is profound, it is not very clear what we mean. But we certainly do not wish to exchange these descriptions for some other term, such as beautiful or important, or construed according to rules, or even immortal, according to the Romantics, and this is one of their principal contributions to understanding in general. What I mean by depth, although they do not discuss it under that name, is inexhaustibility, unembraceability. There is no doubt that although I attempt to describe what profundity consists in, as soon as I speak, it becomes quite clear that no matter how long I speak, new chasms open. No matter what I say, I always have to leave 3 dots at the end. I am forced in my discussion, forced in my description, to use language which is in principle not only today but forever inadequate for its purpose. You have no formula that will by deduction lead you to all the vistas opened by profound sayings. And maybe that's why Nietzsche says deeps and depths and the deep 200 plus times. This too opposed to Descartes, who limited himself to viewing objects singly. If one tries to look at many objects at one glance, one sees none of them distinctly. Heidegger reached naturally towards metaphor, in which more than one thing is kept implicitly, hiddenly, before the mind, since he valued, unusually for a philosopher, the ambiguity of poetic language. He lamented the awful, literally the one-meaningness or explicitness to which in a computer age we tend. Both Wittgenstein and Heidegger, according to Richard Rorty, quote, ended by trying to work out honorable terms on which philosophy might surrender to poetry. And this is, I think, this is also a struggle between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. Jordan's fighting for poetry, and Sam Harris is fighting for a logical ratio philosophy. Wittgenstein's work became increasingly apothogmatic. He repeatedly struggled with the idea that philosophy was not possible outside of poetry, and Heidegger ultimately found himself, in his last works, resorting to poetry to convey the complexity and depth of his meaning. He saw language as integral to whatever it brings forward, just as the body is to Dasein, not as a mere container for thought. Dasein is Heidegger's term. It's like being. It's the notion or nature of being. Words and language are not wrappings in which things are packed for the commerce of those who write and speak. There is also inherent in Heidegger's talk of language an understanding that our relationship with language, like the relationship we have with the world which it images, is not a matter of will, bending words like things to our utility, not one of manipulation and direction, as the left hemisphere has it. It is language that speaks in us, he says, not we who speak it. The idea at first sight paradoxical, once again Heidegger strains to the limit what language can say, incorporates the idea that language connects us to, and in some sense instantiates, wisdom that we need through painful philosophical discourse, or as he increasingly came to believe, through poetry, to permit to speak to us, that we need to listen to what emerges from our language rather than speak through it, which is to impose ideas on it. We need to allow the silent right hemisphere to speak, with its understanding that is hard to put into the ordinary language of every day, since everyday language already takes us straight back to the particular way of being in the world, that of the left hemisphere, that it is trying to circumvent. And this goes back to Northrop Frye talking about third phase language. When we go towards something in an effort to apprehend it, Heidegger appears to be saying we are not naively the prime movers. For us to be able to understand anything, we have already to be in possession of enough understanding of it to be able to approach it. And indeed, we have, yes, we already to understand it in some sense before we can understand it. And if you look at the etymology of understand, you'll see that it goes back to being among something. So you have to be among it. You already have to be in it to know it, to understand. And there's two different kinds of, there's knowing and there's understanding. And this comes up in the debate with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. The idea of truth. Sam Harris has a very Greek idea of truth, that there's an object out there and we're going to conform our mind and being to this object that is truth, that is true. Whereas Jordan has an idea that's more like the Hebrews, that truth, may be that in some ways and sometimes, but there's also the idea of staying true like an arrow is true, and that sin is missing the mark like the arrow missing the mark, and that to stay true to something is to stay true to the covenant of God. This is the Hebrews and their covenant with God. That truth was whatever God told you in the covenant. If God, God told Abraham, go up to the mountain and sacrifice your son. And there Kierkegaard, writes about the father of the faith and how great and how problematic it can potentially be, given this definition of truth. But I like what Kierkegaard says regarding faith. Everybody these days, he says, begins where everyone used to end. So, for example, it took Abraham, Abraham is the father of faith, but it was that moment where he went to go sacrifice his son that, he displayed this great faith. And everybody seems to start with faith, like, oh yes, I believe, I have faith, and this is what I think people are criticizing Jordan for, that's just the easy starting point for us as moderns. I have faith in this or that. I believe in God. But this was the struggle of a lifetime for the ancients, for the people long ago. It was a lifelong struggle to establish that faith. And Kierkegaard says that this is not the easy first step. This is a lifelong struggle to begin to have faith and to understand that, or not understand it at all. There's that Kierkegaardian leap that you go from understanding to not understanding. And anyway, it's something interesting to think about. All right, now we are, I think, done finally with the Nietzsche portion. And like I said, there's more to that essay, but I don't have time to go into it right now. And we're going to get into what got me thinking about us being metaphor. And it's this quote from Fearful Symmetry by Northrop Frye, inspired by Blake. He says, "We arrive at the emotions of acceptance and obedience only at the price of stifling part of our imaginations. In terms of man's desires, we see nothing outside man worthy of respect. Nature is miserably cruel, wasteful, purposeless, chaotic, and half-dead. It has no intelligence, no kindness, no love, and no innocence. In a state of nature, man must surrender intelligence for ferocity and cunning, kindness and pity for relentless fight to survive, love for the reproductive instinct, innocence for obedience to humiliating laws. When we look up from the earth to the whizzing balls of ice and fire in the sky, we see there merely an extension of nature. It is instinctive with the ignorant to worship the sun as the giver of life, and superstition of this sort is described by Blake as ignorant honesty, beloved of God and man. The advance of knowledge in revealing the deadness and remoteness of the sun should not destroy this instinct to worship, but it should eliminate the sun as a possible object of it. Unthinkable distances and endless resources for killing anyone who might conceivably approach them is all the response the heavens afford to the exploring imagination. They therefore cannot be connected with any feeling of love, reverence, loyalty, or anything else we associate with a personal God. And an impersonal God can be worshipped only by the servile, the self-hypnotized, the hypocritical, or at most, the resigned. However, it is all very well to abuse nature, but the divinity in us which Blake postulates is hardly more reassuring. We are capable of depths of cruelty and folly that sink below anything in nature. Yet is not the source of evil the natural weakness of man's body, the form his mind takes in the physical world? Our sight is feeble compared to the lynx, our movements stumbling and foolish compared to a bird, our strength and beauty grotesque compared to the tiger. Once we begin to think in terms of wish and desire, we find ourselves beating prison bars. Our desire to see goes far beyond any telescope. We are ashamed of our bodies, and though the shame itself is shameful, particularly when we realize that they are the forms of our souls. It is there, and it is hard to love a creator who could, for instance, make our places of joy and love excrementitious. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, but in terms of what our imagination suggests we could be, we are a hideous botch. The man who does not use his imagination is the natural man, and the natural man, according to all versions of Christianity except deism, can do nothing good. Yet what does the imagination do except reveal to us our own impotence? The realization that the world we desire and create with our imaginations is both better and more real than the world we see leads us to regard the latter world as fallen. It is a cheap print, or reproduction of what was once the vision of the unbounded creative power of God, and all great visions in art lead up to visions of the unfallen world, called paradise in the Bible and the golden age in the classics. The nature of my work is visionary or imaginative, said Blake. It is an endeavor to restore what the ancients called the golden age. In Christian terms, this means that the end of art is the recovery of paradise. The Bible tells us that in paradise, man was integrated with God. Nature to him was not ocean and wilderness, but his own property, symbolized by the garden or park, which is what the word paradise means. Animals were neither ferocious nor terrified, and life had no pain or death. So what I want to get into here is what this sort of made me think as I read it, in conjunction with something else that Northrop Frye wrote in The Great Code. And he was writing about how science sort of assumes that there is an ideal perception and an accidental perception. And I went over this in some of my other videos. But if you haven't seen those videos, or if you don't remember, or if you need to hear it again, I'm going to try to explain it briefly here again. So there's two sort of ways of perceiving the world, ideal and accidental. And so we used to say sunset in a geocentric era. And so when people were talking about sunrise and sunset in that era, they were then, when science came along and said, well, wait a minute, we're not in a geocentric world here, or solar system. It's heliocentric. We're in heliocentric space. So the Earth is actually revolving around the sun. It's not the sun going around the Earth. The metaphor was not destroyed. The phrase sunset and sunrise, we still use it because what was destroyed in the metaphor was not what the metaphor was trying to convey. It was not the ideal part of the metaphor. It was only the accidental. So what science has done is not prove the metaphor false in its ideal sense, in the sense of what it was trying to get across. Instead, it proved only the accidental parts of the metaphor false, the stuff that has no bearing on the meaning of the word or phrase itself. And this, I think, is what, there's also this great tension between Sam Harris and Jordan, is that Sam Harris keeps railing about how much more we know now. Why are we still using then an ancient book to guide our actions in the world now? Well, it's because all the scientific facts and knowledge that we've built up recently has no bearing on the knowledge that's in the ancient books. Okay, Sam? I mean, I wish Jordan, obviously Jordan's trying to say this, but he just didn't have time. They're two different things. And the fact that, we're not using the Bible to build a space station. Okay? So anyway, so science, I have these little arrows down here. Science sort of shows us the accidental in metaphor. And this isn't a problem from metaphorical truth. I don't think I had time to quite finish this idea on the slides, but So it's not a problem for metaphorical truth. Metaphorical truth is sort of both and kind of thinking, and where things can be sufficiently true and still true enough, as Jordan says. So then what you get is, I think, you get metaphor showing us the accidental nature in science. And this is a problem for science. If you start to work this out this way, so instead of science showing the accidental in metaphor, you have metaphor showing the accidental in science. It works one way, does not work the other in terms of the outcome. And this way, there's a problem for science, because science is very either or kind of thinking. It either corresponds to the world of objects or it doesn't. This is the correspondence theory of truth. This is what Sam Harris rails. So this is science's strength, because it works. This is very pragmatic. We do science and we do it because it works. And that's the only thing they have to say, is that, with these equations, with knowing these presuppositions, we can put men on the moon. See, it works. But it leads to a confidence and an arrogance. I think this is what comes up in Sam Harris and the Four Horsemen, so to speak, of a left hemispheric way of thinking, that it knows everything there is to know. And that's when it makes claims it cannot make. That's when it's trying to say, look, all this ancient wisdom, these old books, we should throw them out. And Jordan kept saying, well, you keep saying you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it looks like you keep trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's the left hemisphere trying to destroy all that it doesn't know or doesn't understand. And that's when metaphor, I think, strikes back. That's when Jordan comes up and starts speaking and people start listening, because this is metaphor striking back. And I think the deeper, I didn't get to put this on the slides, but I think I definitely wanted to, the deeper you go into science, because there's sort of a surface level of science, and I forget who said this, but there are plenty of scientists who say that when you start to get into science on like a surface level, you do sort of have a shaking of your faith for some people, depending on what they bring to this. But then when you get deeper in, you see a restoration of your faith. And this is because the either-or part of science works in some ways. So, for example, in a Newtonian sense, let's say. But then when you get down to something like light and photons and stuff, where there's particles and there's waves, and it's either a particle or a wave, it's both a particle and a wave. Now all of a sudden you start getting messed up in quantum mechanics, where things are not either or necessarily. There are superimposed states of being where you're both and all of a sudden things get murky and cloudy and gray. They're no longer black and white, and I think that's where metaphor and narrative shine and strength. That's their strength. So science is just another story. It has presuppositions. There's a world out there. It is filled with things. We can, quote, know something about those things. That knowledge will be useful. Doing it works, but we don't know why or how. I could find a magic lamp and rub it to summon a genie that will grant me 3 wishes. My actions worked, but I can't tell you how or why. And the genie, as Jordan says, is sort of a metaphor for the brain, for our minds. Not just the brain. The brain is sort of the part. It's the mind that's the whole, that unifies everything. Stories are one layer of reality that help us along in the greater structure of reality. I think this is what Jordan was getting at. You can, as Jordan says, have different resolutions of analysis when regarding yourself and the world. You can analyze the physics, the chemistry, the biology of it. You can analyze the history, the geography, the language. You can analyze the psychology and the religion and the architecture. And you can analyze the analysis, right? You can analyze the narratives, the narrative layer. When you analyze the narratives, you begin to understand that you are part of the narrative and part of the metaphor. This is something I want to get into with my Westworld Wednesdays. And that is another layer of what you actually are. And so of all the things that are possibly true about you, like Vanderklay says, you are your story as much as you are your biology and your physics and all of that. The story is another layer of what you are. You are also metaphor. Your imagination is telling you about the twofold vision of fallen and unfallen. And you're part of that. You're a player in that. As Jung says, people often live out the archetypes. We're living out the story. And as I mentioned in another video, there's a rabbinical saying, I think that Mamet brought up with his interview in Shapiro, the Bible is not a story about what happened, like a history, although some of it is. There is definitely history mixed in. So much as it is a story about what always happens. It's about the story of human nature. You have a nature. You're not a blank slate. And there's a little tiny speck that could be a problem in that I mentioned in another video of determinism, of materialism, but that's not the gist of, that's not what that saying is supposed to be bringing forth. I think it's a misreading, and it's not a true fear to have if you say that it's a story of what always happens. You have to understand humanity in a certain way to live in the world and to live in the world well. So this is the quote from Karl Barth that I want to end the video on. And after understanding all of what Nietzsche said, it's worth looking up on Truth and Lies and on Moral Sense and reading it for yourself. I kind of interjected with different thoughts and thinkers throughout the sections of it, and it may have made it feel disjointed. If you never heard it before or read it before, you may have found it hard to follow along Nietzsche's train of thought, but I did want to put in counterpoints and points that explained a little bit more of what Nietzsche was saying, and I just thought it was an interesting way to lay out the video, splicing it up that way, and hopefully it works for you. But if not, you could always just read the essay yourself to see it as a whole, and then maybe go back and listen to this as a whole and listen to how these different parts play into the essay and how they work with it and work against it at the same time, and how Nietzsche himself works with himself and against himself, because he's railing against language and metaphors, but that's the tool he uses to convince you of his truth rather than your own. So here's something by Karl Barth. And I want to do also a series on the Epistle to the Romans by Barth. It's one of the most powerful books I've ever read, and what can you do? Sometimes I just read it in awe and I just put it down after reading a page. And when I was doing this video, I sort of got sucked into a hole. I just kept reading. I was looking for this quote, or I wanted to say something from this book, and I just kept reading and reading. All of a sudden I was 75 pages in, and I was like, oh my God, I have to stop. At some point I have to stop, just like with this video. At some point I have to end it. Like I said, this is not at all a complete or near complete treatment of metaphor and epistemology. It's just scratching the surface. So this is 2 hours long. It's just scratching the surface. Each of these slides represents a jumping off point that I could do another video on, and maybe maybe each slide I can expand into 20 or 30 minute piece of a lecture or an exploration of a topic that's brought up in the slide. But this is just the beginning. This is just scratching the surface. And so I'm going to end on this this quote here from Epistle to the Romans. Paul is authorized to deliver the gospel of God. He is commissioned to hand over to men something quite new and unprecedented, joyful and good, the truth of God. Yes, precisely, of God. The gospel is not a religious message to inform mankind of their divinity or to tell them how they may become divine. The gospel proclaims a God utterly distinct from men. Salvation comes to them from Him because they are, as men, incapable of knowing Him, and because they have no right to claim anything from Him. The gospel is not one thing in the midst of other things, to be directly apprehended and comprehended. The gospel is the word of the primal origin of all things, the word which, since it is ever new, must ever be received with renewed fear and trembling. The gospel is therefore not an event, nor an experience, nor an emotion, however delicate. Rather, it is the clear and objective perception of what eye hath not seen, nor ear heard. Moreover, what it demands of men is more than notice, or understanding, or sympathy. It demands participation, comprehension, cooperation. For it is a communication which presumes faith in the living God and which creates that which it presumes. So if you found any of this interesting and you've kind of stuck with this video for 2 hours, thank you. Like, subscribe, comment, share it. If you like any of my other videos, try sharing them with Jordan Peterson groups you may be part of. And if you share them, say why you're sharing it. You know, say a sentence or two about why you think someone might want to watch one of the videos that you liked. Thanks again.